So welcome everyone to a New Intellectuals Network webinar special with David Boaz. My name is Isidora Kolar, and I'm the CEO of the New Intellectuals Network, or short NIN. NIN is a US-based nonprofit which is focused on empowering emerging nonprofit leaders, first of all, in establishing new nonprofit and pro-liberty organizations, but also the existing pro-liberty organizations that are trying to kind of get to a better place. And we do this by offering comprehensive training programs and diverse skill building opportunities. And among those opportunities, there are webinars like this one today, where we'll talk to some of the most successful leaders and thinkers in the liberty-focused nonprofit space about their experience and advice for how to lead nonprofits more effectively and achieve greater impact. There will be a Q&A at the end of this webinar, so if you have any questions, please send them either in the chat box or you can ask them yourselves after my conversation with David. So our guest today is David Boaz, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the Cato Institute and formerly its vice president for public policy, as well as executive vice president. And on top of that, David is also the author of books such as The Libertarian Mind, a Manifesto for Freedom, and Libertarianism, a Primer, as well as plenty of other books. Thank you for joining us today, David.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
So I'd like to start with the following question. What made you decide to join the Cato Institute? Because when you joined Cato, that was just a few years after its inception. You joined in 1981, if I'm correct, and the Cato was founded in 1977. So it wasn't the Cato that we know today. So yeah, my question is, how did you find out about it, and how did you decide to join it?
Well, I needed a job. I had known about Cato because I knew Tom Palmer and I knew Ed Crane, and they were obviously key in Ed was the co-founder and Tom was around there. And so when I got out of college, I went to work for a conservative organization. And over the next few years, I realized I didn't really think that I was a conservative or that libertarians are conservatives. So I needed to do something different. And I looked for a libertarian opportunity. And Ed Crane then offered me a job as manager of the Ed Clark for Governor Libertarian Party campaign in California. That was 1978. And so I went out to California and I worked on that, and we had a pretty good time, did a reasonably good job. And then I was commissioned to set up a libertarian business organization, the Council for a Competitive Economy. So Ed Crane and Charles Koch had the idea. I sat down and wrote a prospectus and looked for direct mail lists and how do we find businessmen, that sort of thing. I did that for a year and a half. And then I got invited to join the Ed Clark for President campaign in 1980. And I helped him, well, let's be honest, I wrote a lot of his campaign material. We had a campaign book that I didn't write all of. We had some white papers and things like that. We were probably the most substantive presidential campaign in 1980, even though we were a very small operation. And so, like I say, when we lost that election to Ronald Reagan, I needed a job. And then I got invited to join Cato and go back to San Francisco. I had been living in Washington, but I had done the Clark for Governor campaign out there. So I went back to San Francisco and started setting up the or taking over the policy work of Cato, getting people to write, edit, publish, that sort of thing. And it was the place if you wanted to be a libertarian involved in influencing public policy. Cato was the new kid on the block, but also kind of the only place.
And what was it like building this young organization into what I would say is the most influential libertarian nonprofit in the world right now?
Lately, I've been quoting William Wordsworth on the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. We were very optimistic at the time. We thought the failure of social democracy and Keynesianism, not to mention communism, was so obvious that we had a good response to all of that. We thought we were on the brink of success. That was more the Libertarian Party than Cato, because think tanks never get elected and actually win. But we came to realize that it was going to be a slower process. But we stuck to our principles and our strategy, and we looked for the right people to write for us. And we started very slowly building. And within the first year that I was at Cato, we moved to Washington because we decided that if you wanted to be influencing public policy, you should probably be in Washington, not so much because Congress is here, but because the journalists and the writers, the pundits are all here because Congress is here. So we didn't really come here in order to lobby or influence Congress directly. We came here to get our message out through all the journalists who were in Washington, and that was the way to talk to them. We could have seminars with a lot of people who were interested in public policy. In San Francisco, which is a great city, there just weren't that many people who would want to come to noon seminars or wine and cheese receptions and talk about policy issues. So that's why we moved to Washington. And as I say, I think we started slowly building up.
And why do you think Cato succeeded and grew so much? Is there like a secret behind its success? Was it a right time to do what Cato was doing, or is there more to it?
Well, it's an interesting question of whether it was the right time. I've written about this several times. In 1977, when Cato was founded, the world was divided between communism and more or less capitalism. But a lot of the world was communist at the time. In the United States, there were two political parties, and one of them was always in control of Congress. It was always the Democrats. There were three television networks. There were three major newspapers. So breaking, and also at that time, there was a lot of opinion that capitalism and communism were going to converge, convergence theory. We're going to end up with something, in the middle there. On the other hand, it's also a time, and so it might seem like a bleak time to try to start a libertarian think tank, but it's also true that at that time, the most recent accomplishments of the US government were Vietnam, Watergate, and stagflation. So people were getting disillusioned. People for a long time had thought the federal government ended the Depression and won World War II. So that's, okay, you can trust the government, give them more power. After Vietnam, Watergate, and stagflation, there was a generation that came of age thinking the government is not actually very effective at any of these things. And I think there was a generation of libertarian intellectuals, none of whom would say, I became a libertarian because of Vietnam, Watergate, and stagflation, but that was the, that was the ocean we were swimming in. And so more people found their way to the books of Mises and Hayek and Friedman maybe than had done before. So that was the environment we were in. I think our original formula included a commitment to libertarian principles, independence from any other organization, and what we used to call radical ideas with a mainstream presentation. So we were going to be taking on all the big key elements of the welfare warfare state and offering radical solutions like let's get out of Social Security, let's get out of NATO. But we were going to do it in a mainstream way. We weren't going to be waving black flags. We were going to be publishing books that looked like they should be in bookstores and libraries. A lot of libertarians produced some kind of crummy books. We said we're not going to do that. Ed Crane had a strong sense of design, and that helped. He was very insistent that our publications, our books, and so on, were sharp looking. And then the answer is find smart employees and give them a lot of leeway to do their jobs, and find smart authors that you can't afford to hire, but you can get to write for you. And that really was those were the building blocks of what took us from when we moved to Washington, we had 16 employees. Now we have about 160. So that's an indication of the growth.
Yeah, that's some huge growth. And related to that, what would be your top 3 lessons for scaling to become such a large organization? Because obviously no one starts that big, but Cato did get there. So what do you think are some of the key things that you guys did to get it to that size?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think we ever expected to be this big. So at no point were we saying, what are we going to do when we're double this size? We just grew, and we dealt with it. I suppose the 3 points I just made would be 3 key points about it. Libertarian principles, independence, and presenting radical ideas in a mainstream way. But also, of course, the importance of fundraising. And I should say we had one very large donor in the beginning, and that was immensely important because it gave us some stability for the first few years before we had a portfolio to show other donors, and learning how to adjust to a larger and more complex organization. For a long time, everybody at Cato knew everybody. It's sort of a new CEO at one point said, "You don't even have an organization chart." And we were like, "We know who everybody reports to." But it's true, as we got bigger, the CEO and even I didn't know everybody in the organization. We had to have some layers of management. We tried not to have many layers of management, but we did need more organization. And one of the things we discovered was we not only needed better external communication, every organization wants that, we needed better internal communication, external communication and internal communication, because people in the organization don't like to discover that they've been out of the loop, they didn't know we were going to do this. So we had to create systems to make sure everybody in the organization was informed about what we were doing and what we were planning. And there were plenty of glitches in that process, but it was something we became conscious of. And of course, in the course of all of this, we outgrew the building on Capitol Hill that we had. And so we built our own building, which my friend from New York said, I was complaining about all the government obstacles to building our building. And my friend from New York said, you see, the difference is you have a huge pain with the government in Washington. In New York, no nonprofit would ever think of building a building. So we did build a new building, the one we're sitting in now, I'm sitting in. And then 20 years later, we doubled the size of that building. So that's one of the things when you're growing. Where do you put people? The Brookings Institution, I'm told, now has 5 buildings near DuPont Circle in Washington, because there's no place to build there. You just have to buy another townhouse. That may all change, as we can illustrate here. People don't have to come to the office. And it turns out a lot of people don't like to come to the office. So that's been an adjustment, not so much to being a bigger organization, but to changes in technology and workforce.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so many of us work remotely right now, but then also, you know, a lot of leaders, for example, in Africa, and that's what I've been learning about through this work, they actually still need office space because they don't have access to internet like we do, and so it's different in other countries. But in the Western world, obviously, a lot of us are moving to remote work. And I've seen the Cato building. It's huge. I booked a hotel that is right next to the Cato building, and I had a view. I had a view to the Cato offices. So that was the first time I actually saw it a couple of months ago. And
yes,
it
it's
is
pretty large and very comfortable, and it has a lot of things that are particularly useful for a think tank. Like, we have an auditorium and a couple of conference rooms. If we had rented space in an office building, we could have had offices, but it would be hard to have an auditorium.
No, absolutely. So I want to ask you next, because I think you've been one of the people in the movement who has been intellectually consistent throughout the decades and what you stood for and what you said. And so how important do you think is intellectual consistency to growing an organization?
Well, I suppose it depends on the organization. Obviously, a lot of organizations don't have political principles. They might be a charity or something. They still probably have a vision and a mission, and they want to stick closely to that. So yes, I think that's important, and certainly was important for us. For one thing, having those fundamental principles kept us focused on why we're here, and it became a brand reputation for us. When we were involved a few years ago in a conflict that made the front pages of newspapers, the liberal commentator at the New York Times, Ezra Klein, wrote, "When I read Cato's take on a policy question, I can trust that it is informed by more than partisan convenience. The same can't be said for other think tanks in town. Cato's credibility is derived from its independence." So that's one of the things that intellectual consistency did for us. It gave us a reputation that whatever people at Cato say, it's what they believe. And you may disagree with it, you may think it's crazy, but it is what they believe. They're not being paid by any other organization or anything like that. Now, of course, over the course of 45 years, issues change, and you have to deal with changing circumstances, changing issues, and we hope we get wiser. And so I feel that we've been intellectually consistent and that I've had these views for my whole adult life, but I hope I'm wiser in understanding them and applying them. And that's hopefully true for the organization as well.
And because you have such a vast experience and so many years in the liberty movement, what would you say that is the key component that is missing today in the liberty movement?
People. We need more of them. We need lots more of them. And we need to figure out how to find more and more of them. And we need more principled and consistent classical liberals and libertarians. We don't all have to be pure ideologues, but we need to stay away from the illiberals on all sides. And I know it's very tempting when you're involved in public policy to want to make contacts with politicians, try to influence politicians. And of course, we do that. We testify on Capitol Hill about our policies, and we meet with members of Congress and talk to them about policy proposals and things. But in my view, if you get too close to politicians, you're likely to be more influenced by them than they are by you. And also, these days, so many politicians are so bad. You know, you got the heavy regulators and woke anti-free speech people on one side, and then on the other side, you've got people who want to scapegoat some group, whether it's the Jews or the 1% or the homosexuals or the big business, whatever, and they want to climb to power on the backs of other people. And as far as that goes, on the left, you have the anti-free speech people, and on the right, you have the anti-free speech people. It just depends on what the speech is. So I think it's important to stay away from the illiberals, and there are some people in the liberty movement who have not followed that line of thinking.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, with both points that we definitely need a lot more people, but also that some of the people who call themselves libertarians are not necessarily libertarians. And
Yes.
that's also, you know, I kind of struggled with different labels for myself. I consider myself an objectivist, but then I had trouble for a long time to take on that kind of label because of some of the people that I really disagree with. But then now it's also a problem for me to call myself a libertarian because that's getting not a great connotation nowadays. So maybe we should just reclaim the liberal label for ourselves. That's the one that I like the best.
Well, I'd like to do that. Lots of my friends would like to do that. I think more so in the United States than in Europe, liberal has really come to mean, you know, big government ideas from Franklin Roosevelt to Obama and Clinton and Biden. And so it's difficult to communicate by saying we're liberals. We throw the word in a lot, and sometimes we say classical liberal, but I don't really like saying classical liberal in the general press because classical makes it sound like, well, it's not relevant to today. But I think around the world, liberal still has very broadly the meaning that we want it to have: private property, free markets, free speech, freedom of religion, rule of law, toleration. I've written things in the past about how in South Africa under apartheid, in China and the Soviet Union, liberals are the people who believe in human rights and democracy and market economy. And it's just in the United States where it's confused, although the United States is so powerful in the world that I think our meaning of liberal has spread to some other parts of the world. I remember when Václav Klaus became prominent in Czechoslovakia, he was called conservative. And we thought, well, no, he's a liberal. He read Mises and Hayek and Friedman. Actually, I was told at one time he was a Friedmanite surrounded by Hayekians, but whatever. He was a liberal, at least at that time. And So I was sorry to see the American use of conservative and liberal spreading to new places.
Absolutely. I mean, Europe now already, I don't think people in Europe necessarily know when they're using the word liberal, what it means or what it used to mean in Europe. And so we discussed the momentum basically that you had when you were starting out, if it was the right moment or not. And now I'm interested, what do you think are the major social and political challenges, as well as opportunities that libertarian prophets are facing nowadays? And how do they differ from the challenges and opportunities you encountered when you were starting out?
Well, you know, at least in the United States, one difference between 1977 and now is that we have a lot more friendly competitors. In 1977, we were kind of the only ball game for publishing libertarian policy work. And now there are many groups competing for people and publications, and that's frustrating. We'd like to continue to have a monopoly on being an outlet for good libertarian policy work. But it's obviously better for the movement and the country that there are other organizations that can compete for hiring good people, for producing good ideas, and so on. Another big difference between 1977 and now, obviously, is media. We used to have 3 TV networks and 3 big newspapers. And now, of course, everybody's a publisher. Anybody who wants to get their ideas out, they can go on Twitter and Facebook or Substack or set up their own website or whatever. So there's a lot more competition in that way. You had those 3 TV networks, and then came cable TV and radio talk shows and the internet and social media. So that's a challenge, and it was a big challenge to get a Cato article into one of those big newspapers. Now, it's not difficult to get a Cato article published, but it's still pretty difficult to get into the biggest places. It's just that you can be pretty sure that you will get published somewhere, and it will be on the web, and it will be accessible to everybody in the world. So you have a completely different media environment. For young people, that's sort of not an issue because they don't know the old media environment. They know the one they came of age in, and it's constantly changing. And I'm constantly discovering that there's new social media that I didn't know anything about. I remember I had an assistant a few years ago, and she must have been about 26. And there was some list of, top social media outlets. And she looked at it and said, "Oh my God, I only know 5 of those 6. I'm old." Well, she's older now, and I'm sure there are more that she hasn't been keeping up with. And that's certainly true for me. I can barely handle Facebook and Twitter. I haven't tried going beyond that. But we have young people who do. So we are on TikTok and things like that. So lots of differences in that way.
Yeah, social media has had a major impact on, well, not just on the movement, on everything, on the whole societies. But then also, you mentioned people on the left and on the right both working against freedom of speech. What do you think are some other key policy areas for the libertarian nonprofits to focus on today?
There are so many, and I'm sure it varies by country. But generally, I might recommend, yes, fight illiberalism on both left and right, and defend liberalism, not just libertarianism. We defend libertarianism, but we increasingly feel we have to defend liberalism, not just the vanguard of libertarianism. We need better arguments. We need better marketing. As far as specific issues, some economists say no policy reform would produce more economic growth than free immigration, which allows people to find their best opportunity in a much larger market. I think, and I'm not sure how many places in the world this is true. In the United States, and I think Great Britain at least, housing reform and land use reform would be important factors in economic growth, and also just people being able to find housing and have a better life. But I think major economic benefits. And then for, I think, any libertarian or free market think tank, there's the whole problem of entitlements and spending and deficits and debt. Every time we have an event with our donors, that's what they ask about. What are we ever going to do about this overspending and the entitlements crisis and everything? And I think in a way that's our biggest failure in a world where we have made a lot of progress in human rights, women's rights, gay rights, civil rights. There's been a lot of progress. At least in the United States, for all our complaints, right now speech is freer than it's ever been. Free trade is freer around the world than it has ever been. So there have been a lot of advances for liberal ideas. This is the big one that we've just really failed on, and I despair of what to do about it. We have come up with plans like transforming Social Security into a individually capitalized and funded plan, but they haven't sold to the voters at large or to Congress. It seems to me you do something real about entitlements and spending when your country sort of hits a wall. And I guess when you're the world's reserve currency and everything, then you don't hit that wall, or at least we haven't yet. But places like Sweden and New Zealand have made major reforms because I think they were getting too close to the edge. And we've been telling people for 40 years, insolvency is looming. Let's fix the problem before it gets here. And it hasn't done much good. So if anybody came up with a good plan for how you wean people off the welfare state, that would be a great contribution.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've been seeing in the last couple of days a lot of people arguing about how people need to start having more children so that we can get our Social Security, because like otherwise who's gonna pay for it? And instead of talking about how the system is unsustainable, people are talking about how we need to start having more children. So
yes.
I think there's the problem in people's heads to even consider having a different kind of system.
Yeah, that's also an argument for more immigration, because immigrants would come here when they're like 20 years old and they're ready to start working. So we didn't have to spend money educating them and everything. And then they pay into Social Security for 40 years. I think all of those things are not really what we should focus on. We should focus on having sustainable systems, whether that's a sustainable government-run system or a better privately run system. I'd rather get the system right than encourage people to have more children.
Yeah. Okay, so I have just a couple more questions, and then we're gonna open the floor to the audience. Are you optimistic about the future of the liberty movement, and what are some of your predictions for it?
Well, I'm long-term optimistic because freedom works and socialism doesn't. Fascism doesn't. Theocracy doesn't. Military dictatorship doesn't. In the short term, I'm more concerned. I do see the rise of real illiberalism in a lot of countries around the world, Hungary, Mexico, Turkey, places that weren't that way before. But I also see it in the United States with growing illiberalism on both left and right. So I find it hard to be optimistic right now. In the United States, we're going to elect a terrible president at the end of this year. And that makes a real challenge for people who are trying to defend and advance freedom. It's still true if you look at the Human Freedom Index that freedom around the world has mostly been growing, although there have been some setbacks in the last few years, but I'm still fairly optimistic about that. Of course, one of the big reasons for optimism was China, and now that has reversed. So in the short term, I'm concerned. In the long term, I do believe freedom works. Most people have a sense of that. There's a limit to what they will put up with. But it might be a longer term than I'm going to see.
I mean, it's probably going to be longer term than any of us will see. But I am also very optimistic. And I think as long as we are working on bringing about that freedom, it's going to come. And so my last question would be, what is your one advice to the emerging leaders in the liberty movement?
Well, there are lots of kinds of advice that might be good, but I would say the most important thing is to stick to our liberal and libertarian principles. Be a beacon of light to the world, the light of human rights and market processes. Be an optimist. Definitely, if you're young, you want to be an optimist. You want to think that we have been, ever since maybe the American Revolution, we have been on a winning streak for liberalism, and it's had plenty of setbacks along the way, fascism and communism and world wars, but the trend, the direction has still been in a liberal direction. And certainly since World War II and since the fall of communism, the world has gotten freer and therefore more prosperous, more comfortable for more people being treated as full human beings and full citizens than were before. All of that, we did that. We led that. We weren't alone, obviously, but it was libertarian ideas that did that. And remember that libertarian ideas are radical yet deeply rooted in Western tradition, and we have a record to be proud of. We've been fighting ignorance, superstition, privilege, and power for many decades and even centuries. And it is to those ideas and that struggle that we owe the best parts of our civilization, and from those ideas that we will continue to extend the blessings of liberty to more people.
That was very well put. Thank you so much for that, David. And so now, if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or you can drop it in the chat box.
It looks like there are some in the chat box.
I think I see a few comments. I don't see any questions for now. Let me just see. Okay, does anyone want to ask a question?
Isidora, if I may.
Sure, go ahead, Shane.
David, thank you very much for your talk. That was thoroughly interesting and useful. I wonder about your thoughts on the examples of libertarianism. I live in London at the moment, and we lived through the short-lived libertarian prime ministership of Liz Truss, which has essentially trashed the libertarian word to a certain extent here in the UK for a bit. but we now look at Argentina with Milei with optimism and hope that that might provide a practical example of how libertarianism works. I just wonder about your thoughts on that.
My hearing's very bad, and I'm not sure I got all of that, but I think you did ask about Milei and what we should expect there. I don't know. He says obviously he says some very good things. He also says some very weird things, and I've been wary of how he might blow up. But so far, it seems that his policy proposals as president have been right in line with what we were hoping for from him. So I'm hopeful. Cato is going to have a conference in Argentina this spring with Milei and with people who can give him advice and so on. So I'm hopeful there. I'm not sure there's much of a lesson. I mean, it's such an outlier. He's an economics professor who has a loud, boisterous manner about him, and some weirdnesses like he cloned his dogs. And yet he's obviously a smart guy who understands economics and specifically understands Austrian economics. So I'm very hopeful. He has not converted a majority of the people. He won a majority in the runoff, but his party didn't win very many votes in Congress, so that's going to be a problem for him. But it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I just don't know that there's any other country where you could tell some economist, start going on television and giving rants about free market economics and you can become president. Maybe, I don't know. I think in some of the post-Soviet countries, there were economists who achieved political power, but perhaps not in the same sort of way.
Okay, so there's one question in the chat box. I listened so closely on the challenges when David was presenting it, so touched by many important parts, but he did not touch upon the lack of funds as a challenge, the lack of funding. Do you have any advice for a new think tank that's just starting out for how to get funding?
Well, that's a real challenge. A lot of American organizations use direct mail. I think that's not so common in other countries, but even to do direct mail, you have to have enough money to put the letters in the mail. And to send a lot of letters, that can be very expensive. Cato was fortunate in having one big donor to start us off and give us a leg up, a base of stability for a few years. That's what you'd really like to find, one or a small number of people who would guarantee you some money for at least a couple of years so you can get started and then have a program, some accomplishments that you can take to more donors. It's great to have as many donors as you can, but for most nonprofit organizations, a small number of donors will give you most of your money. And so you have to think about that too. One difference, I think, between the United States and other countries is in the United States, if you give money to a charity, which would include think tanks, you can deduct what you gave from your income when you pay your income tax. I'm not sure other countries do that. And that's a real encouragement, I think, in the United States to give money to charity, whether it's a hospital or a school or something like a think tank. I've never been directly involved in fundraising, and so I'm not sure that I have any better advice than that. I think you do want a clear plan. You want to know what you're planning to do. What is your mission? What are your values? And what do you propose to do to advance those values? And what more could you do if you had more money? Because many of the people who have money that you would like to go to are or have been business people, and they know that businesses need a plan and a mission. So you want to show them that you're as serious as they are about getting from one point to the next.
So this is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much, David. This was amazing and very insightful. And thank you all for joining us today. If you're interested in learning more about how to navigate the Liberty movement and its nonprofit sphere, make sure to follow the New Intellectuals Network on social media, such as Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So
And thank you, Isidora, and good luck to all of you in your efforts in this regard.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.